You
Commissioner,
see Kat anywhere?
Commissioner Dare, Jeff Holschlager is here from the city of Lapine.
Thank you so much. What about Mayor Richter? Is he available today or not, Jeff?
I don't know if he's going to join us today or not.
Okay, all right. Hadn't heard back.
I'll
Thank
text
you.
him really
Thanks for
quick.
being here from
Sure.
the city. Okay. All right. Thank you. It looks like we have Colleen Thomas. We've got lots of people out there. Woody? Oh, yeah, Kat's there. Yes. So, and we have Jeff. So, Jeff, Kat. So we should be pretty good. We should call the meeting then to order. And we do have our agenda available. I hope you brought yours. Introductions. Okay, I'm Patty Adair, Deschutes County Commissioner.
Megan Perkins, Bend City Councilor.
Andrea Blum, City of Sisters Counselor.
Kat, would you like to introduce yourself?
Sure. Kat Zwicker, City of Redmond Counselor.
Thank you so much. And Jeff, do you want to introduce yourself representing Lapine today?
Yeah, Jeff Holschlager, City Manager, City of Lapine.
Okay, thank you so much. All right, we have an agenda to look at. And Cheyenne, I asked Angie if we had the minutes from our last meeting because Eric Kropp is on vacation this week. She didn't know where to find him. So we will share those with everybody, but we should always have minutes, I think, it just helps our meetings.
Yeah, Eric ran that meeting, so I would have to ask him.
Right, and he's on vacation this week, so we will definitely add him. The meeting a month ago, and then this meeting, we'll have both of them attached for the next meeting.
Good.
So, anything else? It looks like we can go to the strategic work plan overview and discussion.
Great. My name is Cheyenne Purrington, Executive Director of the Coordinated Houseless Response Office. Nice to see you all and everyone on Zoom. So today I wanted to walk through a draft version of a strategic work plan that is somewhere between a strategic plan and a work plan. The intention is to ensure that the work is strategic. Before I get started, does anyone have any specific questions that I can get out of the way now, or should I jump in?
Jumping in is always good.
All right, that's what we do.
You usually look first though, in case it's shallow water. So,
All right, so if it's possible, thank you. And I recognize that this document doesn't quite fit. What I can do is encourage sort of scrolling through. So the way that it's organized is to offer an introduction about the way that this document is framed, present cornerstones, which essentially for a strategic plan typically don't change very frequently. These would be true and provide some guideposts for the work over a 5-year, 10-year period. They can certainly be refreshed and updated, but the intention is that those help us sort of frame the work that we're doing and provide some ethical, moral, general boundaries for the work that we're focused on. The goals section presents strategic objectives, which are very high level and meant to give us a measure, some way of knowing where we're at, where we're heading, and how we're doing as we go. Along with that leads into strategic initiatives, which will guide the work of this office, both in the long term or a 5-year period, as well as in the immediate term. This work changes so frequently, as we all know, from either COVID or from the governor's funding. The intention is to provide high-level strategic framework, and I'm going to focus on that because I do want us all to agree that that framework offers us essentially a lens to look through, so that rather than trying to right now, right here, develop a 5-year plan that stays static, that we have a way of making strategic decisions as new opportunities or challenges arise, and leveraging those to make good use of our limited funding, limited staff time, and really be able to achieve those measurable outcomes that we're focused on. And then I do have a section which is a little bit lengthier, little bit more boring. It's really around the administration of the office. I will focus less on that portion to give us more time focused on strategy. The final section focuses on resources. I hear a lot of questions that I think are very good questions, and many of the data points and best practices that I'm asked about don't come from me. They come from federal or state or other resources. So I wanted to offer those. I, even having done this work, still refer to them as, often for data as it becomes available, as well as best practices as they evolve. So I would encourage on your own time to go through them, understand what each website offers. Each website, I think, has a huge amount of resources that we can pull from. And I think will offer us sort of a shared language and framework for how we approach this work. I won't go into the letter from the director, but I do think it's important to introduce where we are, sort of a state of homelessness in Deschutes County in Central Oregon. And so I've shared sort of the high level view of what I'm seeing and what I've heard from all of you as policymakers that represent both a humanitarian and a financial crisis that we're facing. But also I express optimism that we have a really rare opportunity that we can take advantage of in the next year or two to overcome the challenge we're facing and really bend that curve. All right, any questions so far?
Oh, I noticed in your letter, you used the word divorce. And I had used that word when I was trying to get the accessory dwelling unit removed from the fire bill. And people thought that was a bit of a harsh word. So I'm just telling you my feedback. But we were a success. Well, it did go through the Senate this morning, that bill. So, that's the opportunity to get the accessory dwelling units probably up to maybe 9,000 in Deschutes County. So if we can get even 1,000 of those done, that's a lot of housing that we desperately need. So that's kind of our good news for the morning.
Great. Yeah, I think it takes all strategies, and we'll talk a little bit about that. So I wanted to offer just a brief framework for what this document does, what it's intended to do, sort of the process that we can use to ensure that it's refreshed and stays relevant and realistic as we move through this work. The cornerstones are, mission, vision, core values, and guiding principles. This is typical for nonprofits, for any entity that is trying to achieve I would say a big vision and has a clear mission. And so the clear mission of this office, which was funded through House Bill 4123, basically the charter is to create a coordinated houseless response system. And I would say that is both very specific and also a little bit vague. So I have some comments in here that frame what we mean by that system and what it means to create that system. In the introduction, I essentially acknowledge there is already a system, right? We're not creating a system from scratch. What we are doing is trying to remodel that system. And I think it's important to acknowledge all of the incredible work that's already taken place, all of the wonderful investments from cities and the county. We're not starting from nothing, which is such a blessing. And that becomes the foundation. We have a lot of lessons learned about what we need to adapt and how to remodel the system to be more high performance. So instead, I'm offering that our goal or mission is actually to create a more coordinated and higher performance system from the one that we have. And eventually, I'm also acknowledging that this is a startup office. We are starting this office, and eventually it will become an ongoing operating office. And so the goal will shift to say we want to maintain that system. It's not about sort of remodeling or creating it. The vision for this office, and I think all of us hold this, is to create equitable access to safe, affordable housing and stabilizing support services. We know that is what works to end homelessness. And ideally down the road, we've ended homelessness and we're still producing safe and affordable housing. We're still providing stabilizing support services, but to individuals who are housed. So that to me is the broad vision that we're all embracing. And that will really help anchor us when it comes to developing strategy and pursuing big goals. Any comments so far?
You were at the meeting at the Redmond City Council the other night. Counselor Tobias Colvin, I believe, said, where's the substance use disorder and mental health treatments? That was his question that night. And so I just, the second sentence you have, or second part of that sentence is stabilizing support services. That's why I really hope that we can bring Helping Hands over here to Central Oregon, to Deschutes County, because they actually provide some services that I know we need on a greater scale than what's being offered now. Even with as many people as we have that work for Deschutes County, we have incredible teams, but we need more help. And so I appreciate that sentence.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that is the overarching umbrella, and we'll get into a little bit more detail in the next portions. And we can certainly talk about what those interventions might look like locally. So I won't go as much into detail on the core values and guiding principles. However, I think it is important to have these to frame how we make decisions, how we approach this work with compassion, how we understand the individuals that we're serving, and really providing a framework for, holding that humanity. It is a very, I think, important job that we all share to try to address this problem. It is a humanitarian problem. And so I think we need to hold that very carefully. And the guiding principles are intended to offer a framework for how we will do the work, not just what we will do. All right. If it feels comfortable to move on, I'll jump into goals and strategic objectives. And I will offer, I know there's some of our board members on Zoom, so feel free to jump in. We have Angie, who's available to call in your hand if you raise it. So in terms of strategic objectives, the simplest—
Could I just ask, Angie, this meeting is being recorded, isn't it? Okay, because I saw a message on the screen that said it wasn't. So, okay, just wanted to be sure.
So the simplest way to describe what we're here to do is to end homelessness. That I think is what we all understand as our goal. And more specifically, in this work, we often talk about what that means. So what we're trying to do is ensure that homelessness is rare, brief, and one-time or non-recurring. So by that, we mean we want the system to effectively house most of our residents so that very few are actually entering into homelessness. So it's rare. We also want the system to be able to quickly rehouse vulnerable individuals. So the intention is that it's brief. If you do happen to experience the crisis of homelessness, you're quickly rehoused. The services work effectively to triage your needs, and you're not spending any more time in the system than necessary. And then it's also one time. And by that, we mean the system helps keep residents rehoused. So we don't want people to exit the homeless system and then return. We want to reduce the returns into homelessness. This will help us frame the decisions we make about our strategies. So I'll share a little bit more about that. I am often asked about the term functional zero. And so there is acknowledgement in this space that we will probably never totally end homelessness. Like absolute zero may not be possible. Functional zero is a way of describing how well the system works to quickly move people through and meet those needs. So a system that cannot meet the needs, you'll see many more individuals coming into homelessness, staying in the homeless system. We locally have approximately 1,500 individuals experiencing homelessness. The idea is that we want to get down to a level that our system can manage. Right now, our system cannot possibly house and serve all of those individuals. So that's what functional zero means. It's not absolute zero, but it's evidence that the system is working as designed. I think it's really important when we think about strategy to have measurable outcomes so that we know where we are, where we're going, and can assess at regular intervals how we're doing. So the way we look at that data is reflected in that rare, brief, and one time. So we'll be looking for the total number of residents experiencing homelessness, the number of residents who become homeless for the first time.
So are you saying the total number at this moment is approximately 1,500 in Deschutes County?
In Central Oregon, and the majority of that is in Deschutes County.
Okay, and what kind of number is the governor putting funding for people so they don't become homeless? I know that's a critical part of what she's looking at.
So my understanding, and we're going to jump into that in the next topics, but my understanding is that they are dedicating 1.377 million for prevention activities
1.377 in Central Oregon?
in Central Oregon, not just Deschutes.
Okay, gotcha. All right.
So we're also going to be looking for the average length of time that residents remain homeless and the percent of residents who re-enter homelessness. So that reflects our goal in real terms and real numbers. Of course, we have many more metrics that we can look at. There's many more quality metrics to tell if our system is performing well. Connections to services, connections to healthcare, increases in income and benefits, all of those could represent how well we're doing. And it's not that we're not looking at those numbers. I want to offer, though, that we have a sort of headliner goal that we're aiming towards, and that will help us understand whether our interventions are effective.
Shane, can you, how, it says here that the metrics are going to be through HMIS. How would the quality by name list play? Are those metrics that would tie into this?
Yeah, so great question. The quality by name list, every community has what's called a by name list, meaning every individual by name. So we have not just numbers or, case tags, we have literal names. And the intention is that we can sit around at a table and discuss individuals. We can make a plan for individuals. We're not talking about just numbers. The by name list is important for a couple of reasons. Partially because if we don't have that comprehensive list and everyone who is experiencing homelessness is in that system and is on that list, then we don't know what interventions are needed. It's really important that we know who we're talking about and are tailoring our interventions to meet those needs. That list could look really different if we have more veterans or more families, more youth. We want to make sure we know who we are serving. These are residents of this county. We want to understand their needs so that we can meet them. The quality by name list really talks about data quality. And I do have some notes a little bit further down, and it's one of our strategies. The intention is that we have complete data, accurate data, and timely data. Without that, we're running a little bit blind and we won't know, are these interventions working? Are they working in the right doses? Do we have the right capacity in the system? And that we'll get into the framework, but that is how I'm looking at our strategy. Is we have to have that data to know what we're doing. Do we need more veterans housing? Do we need more senior housing? Is it behavioral health needs that are unmet that are causing barriers to get into housing? And it's probably at this point, most of those, right? So we need all of those interventions. But as we get closer and closer to functional zero, the intention is that we're looking at that by name list the entire time to determine, we want to go from 1,500 to 1,000 to 800 to 500. And that is how we will track our progress. I wanted to offer current COC system performance data. This is really meant as a very high view of the data we have available from our systems. I'm offering this lens because it compares our COC to others in Oregon. I'm sometimes asked what the award amount is. I want to make a couple notes about that so that we understand what we're looking at when we see this data, because not all data is complete, accurate, or timely. So this is just one snapshot in time, right? HMIS, you can run a report that shows you how many individuals flowed into and through the system within a year. So that snapshot over a period of time will look really different from a point in time. The awards are based on a number of factors. And these awards are just the funds that flow through COCs, not all of the funding that comes into our community. There's also funding that goes directly to counties and cities. And I think that's one of the reasons it's so important to have this membership here to come together with the COC and make collaborative strategic decisions rather than siloed funding streams.
And this is actually, these numbers are from 21.
Correct.
So I know in 22, I believe a lot more money was spent
Yeah.
for the state.
There's often a lag in when those, we just wrapped up 22, so some of that data is not available yet. Our point in time count, which I know everyone hopefully participated in January, that data will become available in the next couple of months. It requires analysis. So this is what's in our database at a point in time, and it shows really just a snapshot. Sometimes you might look at data and think, oh no, and you assume it's accurate. And so then we start basing decisions on that. What I want to caution against is that often we don't have the right data or quality data. So one of the first strategic moves we'll be making is investments in better data so that we can say, is this actually what's happening, or is this the lack of data and we're interpreting it a little bit wrong? The other question I was going to make a point about is the award amount. So you'll see that the award amounts are really different. And I did calculate that on a per person basis, not to show a disinvestment. It's actually that it's sort of apples to pineapples or something. When we look at, for instance, Portland metro area and Multnomah County, that joint office oversees their COC and a number of other functions. They receive, I think, about $255 million. They have about 95 full-time staff. They also are not just serving the individuals listed in these numbers, they're serving a huge number of individuals who are already in services, in facilities, in housing. So the funds that they receive and distribute and oversee go to serve a much broader number of individuals than just this number. So when I offer data, I always try to offer the way I look at it. So I wouldn't look at this and say, oh, our numbers are the way they are because we don't have enough funding. That's not necessarily what we're seeing with these numbers. The way that COCs can continue to generate more funding and draw down more funding and be eligible for more funding is to show performance, so improvements over time. And that includes, data performance, program outcomes. If we receive funding, we want to show that we use that funding and that we need more funding. So there's a lot of ways that we can be working really closely with our local COC to make strategic investments in their ability to perform within the HMIS system. Those investments will come back to us because we'll be able to leverage state and federal dollars more effectively with those investments. So
Is our local COC, how many people are full-time working for that?
0. A COC is a volunteer sort of membership of a cross-section of providers and housers, government officials, and every community, not necessarily county or even region, but it can be a city, it can be a county, it's sort of defined by the region. Every COC is mandated, so you have to have one. HUD requires that you have one. And it's intended to bring a diverse perspective to how those funds are distributed locally. They have an administrative support from COIC. So there's staffing that supports the work. That would include, receiving the funds, reviewing applications for the funds, distributing and overseeing those funds, making sure reporting is happening. There's a number of things they do beyond just distributing funding. They manage the point in time count. There's a ton of work they accomplish on a volunteer basis. So it is not uncommon to see investments in staffing a COC to give more support. They do have a contract with Neighbor Impact to provide HMIS and sort of coordinated entry support, which I think could benefit from having more staffing, especially with the governor's orders. We will see a significant inflow rather than the 750,000 or around 800,000. We're going to see, 14.5, 15 million come into our community in a very short period of time. So having more staff in strategic positions will help all of the projects that are going to come underway. And I think it's going to be a team effort when we look at how to get ready for doing that work and make sure that it's efficient and effective.
Thank you.
Yeah. I have a couple of other data notes in here. I just think that it's important for all of us to have a high level view of the data and understand that it's not always what it is. It doesn't mean it's wrong. It means it tells us something, which may not be the actual number, but there might be something behind that number. So I find that with homelessness, often data is missing or incomplete. We don't always have the numbers we wish we had. The commitment of this office is to make strategic investments in quality data, the quality by name list, and the coordinated entry system, because that is the best practice for how to effectively achieve functional zero.
Shane, I'm just curious, since you're saying it's 1,500, the count for Central Oregon, that had to be a grouping, adding together, Juniper and East Antler and, the airport, little parking, that area. How many were in the China Hat area when you added up and came up with 1,500?
So this data is not from the point in time count, which is a visual survey that's conducted on one night a year.
Yes, in January.
So that data isn't available yet, but I can certainly get it to you and we'll invite the COC to present on it when it's available.
Okay, but I mean, the 1,500, somebody had to, there's different areas that we know we have significant amount of homeless living. And I just wondered what the number they were using, because I was told like last fall that they were living in 4 miles within China Hat area. And there were, I think 100 and so many camps and several people per camp. And, and I witnessed it February 2nd. But at that time, we weren't counting up, a running total. And I really wish I would have, but somebody's supposedly working on that now for me. So I do appreciate that.
Yeah, if you have other numbers from agencies that, if they're tracking that, I've sometimes asked the Forest Service if they know.
The Forest Service does not know. I had a meeting with them March 3rd.
So they've got a pretty good measure for sisters. I know I was just up there with your team and they've got a really good relationship up there. Having good data is really a foundational piece of this work. Whenever the COC does provide those numbers, I'm happy to have them come and present on their findings. So if it's okay and there's no comments online, what I'll move on to is the strategic framework.
Are there any comments, any questions online? Kat, Jeff?
No, I'm good so far.
Okay, thank you.
All right. So you'll see at the top this banner of rare, brief, and one time. And the way that we can think about that simply is before, during, and after. What we do during those times is prevention, crisis response, and housing and services. Of course, we're doing the work of housing and services throughout, but really we're thinking about how do we keep people housed where they already are? How do we intervene quickly when they do experience crisis? And how do we provide sufficient housing and services to keep them stably housed? This framework allows us a sort of a window to look through to make good strategic decisions. I think often strategic plans will be a little bit more tactical. They talk about a lot of actions. And with this document, I'm hoping to provide us with a framework that will last. So even if things change, we can keep going back to this framework and use it as a window to examine the current landscape of funding, the current policy landscape, what's going on in the world that we need to be reactive to or responsive to. Traditional strategic plans, we would sit down over the course of a couple of days, maybe with a broad range of stakeholders, and take a 5-year lens on what we want to achieve. And we would have a long list of actions. What that has done is over the past, probably 25 years, the pace of the world has picked up so fast. Information changes, the world changes. So it is much harder to be responsive and strategic. We cannot allow a plan to sit on a shelf or commit to it, ignoring the changing world. I think the pandemic is a great example of how everything kind of went out the window and many things changed really quickly. And this type of strategic planning, rolling planning, is focused on a framework that stays resistant to all of those things and allows us to keep coming back and adapting more quickly, but stay strategic. stay on course. There's nothing about changing course that isn't strategic or isn't planful. We can still do planning work. So on the left-hand side, you'll see critical areas that address what I think of when I think of a system. We often talk about system capacity, but I also want to call out capability. So a gap in a system, like if we didn't have emergency shelter beds, that's a capability our system doesn't have, right? Luckily we do, but respite care, for instance, is sorely missing in Central Oregon. So we have individuals who are exiting from the emergency departments locally directly onto the street or into our shelter system. So having sufficient respite care. Another good example would be permanent supportive
Do
housing.
you know how many respite care beds were short?
I've been working with St. Charles and Mosaic to come up with that number. I think we've decided that between 6 and 10 would be sufficient, at least for the Bend area, which is where we see the highest acuity, but certainly Redmond could benefit from those as well. Many individuals are receiving their emergency care here in Bend.
Okay, 6 to 10.
Cheyenne, with the respite care beds, is that just adult beds? Are we doing any consideration for juvenile?
That's a good question. And at this point, I feel comfortable saying probably just adult. I think that juvenile is less frequent. And so designing a program just for that, it seems like either a smaller gap or infrequent, but certainly 6 to 10 beds, either at an existing site or a new facility. They do not need to be intensive care beds. Respite beds can actually just be, have a service provider who's not a nurse, providing supports and attending to, basic needs. But it is right now a strain on our shelter system to have individuals with respite care needs showing up in congregate shelter with 100, 120 individuals. It is creates strain, and I think is a risk to have medically fragile individuals in with a general population that is, non-congregate or everyone's all in one room. So we're looking at some potential solutions for that. Notably, there are quite a few funding sources that can be braided together to make that possible. So I think the governor's funding will provide an opportunity to add respite care shelter beds.
Well, last week we learned that half of the beds at Bethlehem and Redmond were empty, 44 beds. So it seems like to me, you could hire a nurse if that's possible to come and treat those people if there are. It sounds like there's rooms that actually would be available to give those people a better place for care at this time.
Who would hire a nurse?
No, I meant that's what we have to figure out. Where's the funding coming from? But, if that's what they really need, they need respite care. At least we have, we did learn about that last week.
I've spoken with their team and they're doing great work. I know that initially staffing was a constraint. And so now that they've resolved that challenge, they're able to, over time, fill those beds. It's not that there's not a need or that they're not working hard to fill those beds, but we wouldn't see 44 people move in immediately. So I suspect that over the next couple of weeks, we'll see those beds occupied. Also, they are a high barrier shelter, which requires more screening at intake. Low barrier shelter or emergency shelter beds where someone can just walk in without a screening process. We typically see our overcapacity. What that tells us is that we have within our community a great need or an unmet need for low barrier solutions for people with higher acuity or for more barriers to access. These are all really excellent comments. We're going to walk through some of these. Actually, you'll see them reflected in our strategic initiatives. I do want to make sure that we spend time on this framework so that we feel comfortable with this as our lens that we'll keep coming back to as the landscape changes. So when we think about capability, does our system have the interventions and competencies that we need? So do we have respite care? Do we have permanent supportive housing? Is it missing? Is it a gap?
No, it's back. Angie, it's back to the other page. She's just going down that, I believe.
So then capacity addresses something different, which is how much of an intervention we have. So, if we have 30 shelter beds, but we need 100, that's a capacity gap. We know that we need to stretch to increase our capacity. We know how to do it. It's not a capability issue, but it's a capacity challenge. Similarly, you might see a capacity challenge around staffing. So We know how to deliver sheltering, but we don't have enough staff to do that work. It's hard to hire. So that is how we can ask ourselves, what problems should we be solving and what is the strategy to solve it? I also think it's really important to call out coordination. Sometimes we have a system that has all the right components, we even have the right capacity, but there's a lack of coordination. So we need to move in a direction where projects, programs, partners come together and break down some of that siloing so that there's more movement quickly of clients through the system. Many of these interventions are held by different partners. So a low barrier shelter might be Shepherd's House. Bethlehem Inn provides high barrier shelter. We want to ensure that all the way from the street outreach team into low barrier shelter, into high barrier shelter, into housing, that there's coordination across so that a client experience of moving through the system is as efficient and effective as possible.
I guess before you get into the specifics, this is sort of a more general concept about, or concept question here. I guess when I'm looking at this, yeah, that's great. That's great. I guess how will this be accomplished? And how do people know how this will be accomplished? And I guess the other question is sort of what is the office's role versus what will our role be, the county's role be in these strategic initiatives?
Great questions that we're going to get into.
Awesome.
So the
Great.
strategic initiatives, I think, is a framework of what we're going to do.
Mhm.
And then we do have a conversation about roles and responsibilities. And
Great.
the reason I wanted to start with this is because I think this frames sort of what the work is.
Mhm.
And then within that work, we want to figure out what are the appropriate roles and responsibilities for this office, cities, county, other partners, nonprofits, business partners, all of that, right?
Yep.
But I think it's important to start with what are we doing? So I'll just flow through these. Performance. We want to know, how is our system working? Is it effective? Is it efficient? At delivering these interventions. We also want to be thinking about equity and access. Is everyone able to access these services? Is it equitable? We know from the data right now that it's not. That is common across the country. We know that if you are a person of color in Deschutes County or in Central Oregon, you are far more likely to experience homelessness and far less likely to be connected to services and housing. So there's a huge equity challenge that we need to be thinking about when we develop our strategies. As I mentioned before, we want to ensure that our data is accurate, complete, and timely. If it's not, we are not able to assess capacity. We're not able to assess capability. We don't know what equity looks like. So we have to have that good data. And the idea is that all of this allows us to come up with the outcomes that we stated before. So we come back to these very simple outcomes. Before, during, and after. Very few people coming into the system. Very short period of time spent in the system. And very few people re-entering into the system, which produces hopefully the total residents in our system goes down over time. So I want to pause there because this to me is a tool for developing strategy that is tailored to our objectives. I often see objectives, the strategies don't match. They wouldn't help us arrive at those outcomes. And then the tactics, you could accomplish all the tactics and still not meet the objectives. So I'm trying to give us tools that allow us to, over time, continue to check on our outcomes, ensure that our strategy is effective, change our strategy when needed, and feel like we are ready to start divvying out roles and responsibilities and relationships.
Are there going to be like specific targets that will be communicated or metrics?
That's my hope.
Yeah, I mean,
Yeah.
because I think that would be helpful. Like, if we're trying to, expand provider capacity to pursue and secure, just to pick one of them, what?
Yeah.
What are the?
So that is my hope, and this is meant to be a conversation. So one of the first challenges I see is what needs to come first. In my view, we need to be doing data work most intensively now, because what we might see is that actually when you improve your data and you have more and more complete data, you actually see your numbers go up, right? And one might say, oh, the numbers are going up, let's stop working on data. That's obviously not the case, right? So we need to understand that to have a clear picture of who is experiencing homelessness, why, what their needs are, and then tailor interventions, we need that complete data. So in the first 6 months, we may make major investments, sort of readiness investments in data, and see these numbers go up. Once we feel like we've achieved a quality by name list, we can probably start some of that work of, what target should we look for? I do sometimes worry that we pick targets just to have something, which is actually fine with me. I think it's good to have something that you're reaching for. I think, percentage targets, like what would it take to reduce homelessness by 10%? And adjust that target, knowing that as we increase the data that goes into the system, that overall is also increasing, right? So these are, I think, dynamic conversations this group should be having, and in concert with the COC, the people who work with this data every day, with the individual providers that provide these interventions. This is the community conversation we need to be having. And we have a lot of existing knowledge in this space that we can leverage. We know what works. We don't need to come up with brand new interventions or try to figure out our own way through the data. We have Built for Zero through community solutions. We have, excellent technical assistance available from the state and from the federal level. So we are not alone in this, and we are not starting from any kind of scratch, which is great. I always say, beg, borrow, and steal. This work is too important to hold on to what we know. We share openly and we borrow openly. And we'll see that reflected in these strategic initiatives. These are not opinions. These are evidence-based and data-based best practices that we know work from decades of data. That's the good news. All right. It sounds like folks want to jump into strategic initiatives, and I'm happy to do that, but I want to pause in case online we have any questions.
Are there any questions online?
No, I'm good.
Okay.
I have another one.
Yeah.
Sure. One of the things that the Emergency Homelessness Task Force talked a lot about, which led to the Houseless in Deschutes website, was the importance of educating and working with the community and community engagement. And that's something that I'm not really seeing, and it became like a really important role, I think, for the strategic plan. And I'm not seeing that in here. Coordination kind of, but it doesn't really address like the community. And, I think that's something we hear a lot, is that there's a lot of distrust in the community about this work and distrust of the data. And so can you kind of address that, and how we could somehow bring that into this office's role and this framework?
Sure. So I think we would want to understand what the objective of that communication, sort of a general education, community engagement or education. I would want to understand what are the best practices for that and how do they relate to the objectives. Mm-hmm. I have included it to a lesser extent in the administrative plan, but this office currently is not staffed or funded to achieve a broad community action plan to engage folks. Community engagement is often most effective for targeted projects. So for instance, to stand up a housing project, we would do neighbor engagement. It tends to be less effective as sort of a broadcast trying to bring everyone along on an education journey. I think that this office, my recommendation would be to have a community engagement toolkit that can be utilized by providers, by cities, by counties, that offers the data, offers frequently asked questions. I do not think that this office, as it currently is positioned, has sufficient capacity to achieve this charter of creating a more effective system and what would probably be a full-time communications person. I understand that's an interest, like it would be nice to have. It's just not staffed or funded that way at this point. Mm-hmm. So I think the role of this board could include evaluating all of the work that is scoped in this strategic plan and say, yes, looking at the work that's outlined through this strategic framework, we agree that this is the right work. And knowing that time is limited and here's what staffing we have available for a 2-year period, we want you to focus on these things. Mm-hmm. I will also mention this office, the way I understand it, was established as a coordinating body, not a consolidating body. So it is not uncommon to have a joint office that absorbs many other functions like the COC, the Public Housing Authority, housing development work, programs, delivery of street outreach, coordinating consolidated communications for an entire region. This office was not established with that framework or that funding. It would need to be a conversation to identify further funding and make, there's a opportunity cost.
Mhm.
So if we do one thing over another, and I'm super open to those conversations, that's for this board to review and decide.
I mean, I would argue that, and the funding conversation, that's another conversation, but, I would argue that the whole idea of a coordinated office is to present a coordinated approach to this work. And I think that obviously includes the community, so that it's not sisters saying one thing and Ben saying another and Deschutes County saying another, but that there is an office that's providing that community education. And so I think that's something that's worthy of future conversations for sure.
Absolutely. I do think another potential conversation is that this office was established with a lot of responsibility, like that would be a responsibility, and very little authority.
Hmm.
I have no authority over any of your entity's policies. I can make recommendations, and you are all, members of governing boards of other entities. Those entities oversee funding, staff time, resourcing, policies. And we can certainly talk about that. I think it will be important to keep those lines clear, that the charter of this office is different and maybe has some overlap, but is different from those entities. And I think responsibility and accountability should live with authority. If there's no authority for something, for instance, if there's an action in Sisters that my office maybe didn't decide or declare, I would support their messaging, but maybe not take the lead, right? I think that's an appropriate sort of clarity of roles. But I think it is an interesting conversation and I'm very open to it. I just think that's when I look at, currently I'm staff of one. I have a team member coming on soon, which is great.
When will they come on?
My hope is early next month.
Okay,
And I'll share
April?
more with you. Yeah, when I have that information.
okay, but they've been hired.
They've been offered.
Heard a
and
job.
accepted.
Okay, and we're still going through the process. Got you.
So those are conversations that I think we can jump into. And that's why I want to offer this like a large framing of strategy, because it is a strategic decision to do one thing over another. And I want to ensure that we all are feeling comfortable with how that's being framed. If there is more funding available and that becomes a priority for the board, then we would move in that direction. So I want to talk through some of these initiatives and be mindful of time at the same time. So I have broken these out into what we saw on the left hand: capability, capacity, different types of initiatives. I think it's helpful to be thinking about those because we want to be addressing them all. So I have heard from many of you that we want to address critical emergency shelter system gaps. And we've discussed some of them already. Another one that I think is worth mentioning is severe weather and disaster sheltering. So currently that happens sort of ad hoc, and a lot of churches may raise their hand to do it, but it's not really a standard process. It's not really supported at the county or city level necessarily. My hope is that we could bring more capacity to that work, so that it's actually happening in a sort of best practice and standard way. Expanding the range of specialized program options for subpopulations. So we see that there are critical gaps in the system around families with minor children. Currently, there's no emergency shelter. Many individuals will show up at the Shepherd's House Lighthouse Shelter. It is not a best practice to mix the youth population with an adult population in emergency shelter setting. So having a space that families can go and quickly be served would be really important. In terms of pipeline of affordable housing types, we know that we have critical gaps when it comes to permanent supportive housing, low income subsidized housing, nonprofit owned and managed housing, and even some board and care settings. So these are gaps in our system. And what it does is if you have that gap, there's strain in every other direction. So currently, someone who needs permanent supportive housing may be placed in just traditional affordable housing without services. They're a high likelihood of re-entering back into the homeless system if they don't have those stabilizing supports. These are similar, but we talked about shelter bed capacity, adding new sites, adding more beds to existing sites, increasing the services and staffing available at those sites.
And
We
then
also
the
really
other
wanna-
side of the story, Cheyenne, sorry to interrupt, but hearing from Bimart in Bend, their business has been clearly impacted by the navigation center next door. So somehow we've got to be respectful of the community too. It's, people are feeling uncomfortable with what's going on there.
Mhm.
So to go back to like the develop a sufficient pipeline of affordable housing types. So let's take like permanent supportive housing, for instance, I mean, there is a Cleveland Commons is being developed. I guess this is where like the how is coming to mind. I mean, we are trying to develop, and it's incredibly expensive, and like that's just an example of I'm trying to understand how this all happens then, right?
So
Yeah,
this
thank
isn't.
you for bringing that one up because I'd written Cleveland Commons down. When is that going to be available for? Wasn't it like 36 units or something?
It's taken a long time.
Right.
Yes,
Well, of course.
of course, as it does.
Yes, we know that.
So this plan doesn't get to the level of project planning that I think is for staff to be determining. It changes on a daily basis. However, I will say that I'm in close contact with their team and worry quite a bit about not having a lead operator that has permanent supportive housing capacity. I worry about funding gaps that they've expressed and trying to fill them. So some of the ways this office provides support to teams like that would be to make connections to permanent supportive housing training so that we can build local capacity, and not just for one team, but multiple teams that might be sort of prepped and ready to take on permanent supportive housing in the future. I'm also working with a number of nonprofits to identify funding gaps in their programs and bring in technical assistance to provide more training, and even just hands-on, like helping with applications. Leveraging more state and federal funding for local programs will be really critical. So that is a sort of coordinating resources to needs role of this office. And if a new project popped up tomorrow and, we say, oh, the governor's funding is going to support some permanent supportive housing, I would add that to my list of supporting projects. I think if I were to go to that extent, this would become a suddenly 100-page document.
Yeah.
And so this is not meant to project plan, but I'm happy to provide more clarity. And my hope would be that on a regular basis, I come back to this board with notes on what this office is actually tackling, both in the last month since we've met, as well as sort of a look ahead of what that looks like, so that we all agree the work we're focused on fits with this strategic plan. And I'm sure none of you wants to know all the details of every single project we're working on, because there's many, but if you have specific questions about certain ones, I'm happy to talk with you about that. Those to me fall to the level of sort of daily tactical work. If we decide that we want to have a list of projects or specific roles and responsibilities, I'm happy to jot that down and make that note.
Well, I think it's important because the county commissioners spend a lot of money on affordable housing. In fact, I went back and reviewed that the other day. There was a 60 unit apartment building in Redmond. And I looked online and it looked like it was actually open on Canal. So that was supposed to be affordable housing for our community and seniors. And so it's like we have done things and some of them have carried through. And, just seeing that all, per some type of report, I think is good to know that we have made some serious commitment to this, just like Cleveland Commons.
I think that's a great idea.
Yeah,
Having some idea of
Right.
what's happening in each city and the counties and I think that would be really.
And once you get some staffing
Yeah.
available, it would be wonderful to have a site. You wouldn't have to, because by the time we have our monthly or quarterly or whatever, we wouldn't want to spend all of our time looking at ongoing, but if there was a site we could go to and see where the project is and what's happening and whatever, we could just look it up ourselves.
Yeah.
I'm happy to do that. I will say that for affordable housing projects, which is not the exclusive focus of this office, I would probably include a link to existing resources that already provide that information. So I think that's where I could see this office, providing the resources.
Yep.
Yeah. I made a note about that and I think we'll find.
There might even be someone in IT that can help. Don't you think, Nick? Nick's shaking his head.
Once I get staff.
Yeah.
You get staff. We all
Yes.
agree. Yep.
So walking through these, wanting to highlight a handful of specific priorities that I think are really critical. One of the coordination initiatives is to promote interagency participation, coordination, and alignment. And you'll see that the top banner is something we're actually focused on today. So I want to make sure we have time for that conversation, which is to start thinking about the local government roles, responsibilities, and relationships. I also think it's really critical that we start thinking about cross-sector partnerships. Some of the best projects come from partnerships rather than one agency taking the lead. So I also want to be in conversation with private sector partners who can develop at scale, because if we are going to produce sufficient housing in our region, it will not be with nonprofits taking the lead on that. There's no nonprofit locally that can produce at scale quickly enough. We would need to be partnering with private partners. And I think that's leveraging the best strengths of each of the public, private, and nonprofit sectors. So those are some of the conversations I'm hosting and convening so that we can create a model that does produce at scale, and not just generic affordable housing, but housing that is targeted specifically for individuals exiting homelessness.
Shannon, under coordination initiatives, maybe I'm not seeing it, but one of the things that we hear a lot is coordination between service providers and communication between service providers, and input from service providers. How did they provide any input on this plan, and how can we make sure that that's part of the very important coordination efforts of the office as well?
Yeah, so those I think are two different things that I'll tease out. So one is coordination of service providers. I have been offering support to a handful of the teams, both I think Sisters, Redmond, and Bend. Part of the goal I have for this office is not to duplicate efforts, and many of those efforts already exist. In fact, I sometimes hear from providers like I'm giving the same updates in 3 different meetings every week. And so my intention would not be to then have another of that kind of meeting.
Sure.
I think the second piece that I heard is, and so I think it's more important in some ways for the staff of this office to go to the existing meetings and listen in and ask, what would you want to see changed in the system? What's helping, what's a barrier you're reaching with a client, that kind of thing. So case conference meetings, provider meetings, any of those settings. The other way that I think we would hear feedback from that group and others is the advisory council, which is another topic for later on. I think it's really critical to have that broad range of perspectives on this work. And I partner with many of them informally and have the hope of formalizing that work. So that I think lives more in a formal advisory council. So moving to performance initiatives, this is this idea that we have a system and we want to track how well it's performing. And in addition to capability and capacity and coordination, we want to ensure that the system people are moving quickly through it. So we want to make sure that placements are appropriate, that referrals are happening quickly and are to the right types of programs. We want to ideally be moving clients quickly through the system. So someone comes into a shelter setting and they move from shelter into housing quickly. They don't stay in a shelter setting for an extended period of time. You saw in the data that I initially flashed that the current time that someone stays in our system, stays homeless, the average is about 120 days. That's the longest in Oregon. So we need to be moving people more quickly through the system.
But then again, when we're talking about our Veterans Village, that program was set up to allow those people, and they came from being homeless, to be there for up to 2 years. And I believe we've already had 10 successful people that have moved on, but they are given that comforting thought that they can be there longer than, what did you just say, 120 days?
That's the average time someone's in the system. It may be in a shelter or not. It could be, so looking at specific programs to evaluate and assess their effectiveness. I will make a note about that, which is that programs that are up to 2 years are considered what we call transitional housing. Those have been phased out at the federal level for the most part because they're less effective than just permanent housing. The reason is that unless someone's in a transitional period of life, what they really need is just stable housing, like long-term housing. So the funding that we see now is only for transitional periods of life. So that may include domestic violence survivors who are exiting from a violent home, domestic or sexual violence, as well as youth 18 to 24, often exiting from unsafe homes or having been an unaccompanied minor and now turning 18 or out of the foster care system. As well, we see programs that are effective for reentry from incarcerated or other institutional settings. Someone who is a senior on fixed income is not in a transitional period of life. They need housing for their retirement. And so we would not see those be as effective, which isn't to say that the veterans program isn't. It's just that's why there's not as much funding for that type of program. And so one of the concerns I see with developing programs is, will this model be eligible for funds down the road? So does it use coordinated entry? Does it have best practices built into the program model? Does it have equity as a consideration? And is it a fundable program because it's a best practice? So not saying no to transitional housing, just wanting us to remember, like, is this the right intervention and what funding can be used? I mentioned equity and access. One of the major focus areas of this office is barrier removal. So a lot of systemic barriers for individuals moving through the system. Many of them impact folks who have disabilities or maybe of color or are a member of a marginalized community. So wanting to create a system that has, low to no barriers.
I'm trying to remember the statistic. Was it 40% of our house's population is disabled or higher than that? It was it's a
Likely
high
higher.
number.
What we see is that many individuals have disabilities, but have not yet certified them. And so it shows up differently. If you ask someone, do you have a disability? If it's not certified, they may say no, because
Yeah,
I'm
it's not
waiting
physical.
for my disability.
Yeah.
But as we know, having a disability may create a barrier to getting into that system.
Yeah.
So advocacy and systems navigation is really critical so that individuals who cannot work, we see it almost exactly split. The number of individuals in the system who are eligible for fixed income, whether it's retirement, social security, or disability, and the individuals who are working. There's very few individuals who are not doing one of those, either working or unable to work or already worked a full, they earned their retirement. But once someone's on fixed income, it's almost impossible to get housing that they can afford because those fixed incomes are so low. Any other questions for what we've already walked through?
No, it is 12:04. Well, we do have,
Yeah.
we have some other things to.
So some of the other comments that you've made show up in here, discussing policy advocacy and broad systems change, access to coordinated entry, quality and timely data, and the quality by name list. These are not comprehensive to all of the work. And my hope would be, I wanted to showcase how we can use the strategic framework to add to this. And so this is meant to be a conversation start, not an end. I would like to hear your feedback either now or another time, so that I can incorporate that. And this is an evolving document. It's meant to be a rolling strategic document. Not to say we're changing everything all the time, but that we're adding what is missing and that we're adapting to what's changing. It's not meant to be a static on the shelf document.
Is the quality by name list and the coordinated entry system two different things?
Yes, but related. So what used to happen is that if you were experiencing homelessness, you would have to walk all over town, try to figure out where to go, put your name on a list and wait for services. So chronological wait list. The federal government studied that and saw what was working in certain communities and raised those up as best practices. So now what instead we do is There's one central place that you can go. You don't have to call around and go on wait lists and try to figure out where to go. You go to one central place. Instead of having different assessments, you have one standard assessment. So everyone's got the same intake. And then instead of showing up on different lists and waiting, everyone goes on the same list. So that's the by name list. So coordinated entry system is sort of the broad way that we centralize everyone going through the same front door. And then you arrive there on a list. However, it's not a static list, it's a dynamic list, and it's dynamically prioritized based on vulnerability. So if you are high vulnerability, you would show up at the top of that list. So the next program placement that's available or the next housing unit that's available will always go to the most vulnerable person who's eligible for that program. Meaning that if someone scores just a 2 and they're highly likely to self-resolve, they're probably staying in a sheltered situation with family, they may be working full-time with no medical vulnerabilities, will be lower on that list. Someone who has multiple co-occurring mental and physical disabilities, is disconnected from care, has no income, would show up at the top of that list. Right. And that makes moral and ethical sense to us. Like if we have scarce resources, which we know we do, they should be prioritized for the people who need them the most. So that system does that better than what we used to do and expect people to sort of figure it out and wait on a wait list. Yeah. I don't want to walk through the administrative functions. If you have questions about those, they're largely sourced from the House bill language. And so, you know,
Okay, it did say on here that we were going to have quarterly planning retreats will be scheduled for 4 hours. And I haven't seen one on the schedule yet. So I'm wondering, do we know when we're going to do our first one?
yes, so I have some plans for that I will email you about. But my goal is to, essentially, we have the City Club presentation on this plan, and I'd love for all of you to join me. We also have a summit for the cohort of pilot groups. So all of the House bill pilots are going to be joining us here in Central Oregon, and I've offered to host because we're central. And so they are going to be coming with electeds from all of those communities. And so that is what I'm offering or inviting as our first quarterly retreat, is essentially participating in that process, because we can learn and listen to what's going on in all the other offices and see what those communities are doing. You can talk to your peers at city council and county level.
Okay, so the city council is on the 18th of May. City Club?
City Club,
Okay, but when is the other one then?
not yet scheduled, but the hope is to have it in the same month.
Okay, because on this one, it said governing plan retreat on your schedule ahead for April 20th, but we're not going to do it that day, the 4 hours.
It's your decision. I'm happy. This is a draft document and I'm happy to take direction.
Okay. So how's that sound for everybody?
Looking right now.
Are we good? Kat, do you want to check your schedule?
Yeah, what was that date again? Because I was on.
It was April 20th. It was our regular meeting time. What is it, the third Thursday?
April 20th, I'm not down. Oh.
Remember, we're doing this
Yeah,
meeting today
I
because
can
we don't have a
reschedule
meeting.
some things. I
Right.
can make April 20th work.
It does. Okay, good. All right. Yes, you're already in the schedule. So if we're saying it's going to be, what, 4 hours? Is the idea?
10 to 2.
10 to 2?
Have lunch.
Too.
Okay. 10 to 2, Kat.
Got it. Thank you.
Thank you. And we'll let Daniel know.
Sounds good. Any other questions about the administrative portion of this plan? It's really just meant to consolidate all the language that we see about how this office runs and requirements to meet.
Okay, that'll be great then, because there's some more details in here that we really need to get to.
Yeah.
And if we've got more time, that will be excellent.
Great. All right. Okay, to shift gears.
Please.
All right. So last time I had circulated a budget, and we're coming actually very soon coming out of this fiscal year into the new one. So I wanted to hear if there are any requests or priorities for the upcoming year budget. This current year budget was pre-planned before me. We don't have that many programs we run, so it's really just the staff time and some administrative cost. So wanting.
There's a program expense for 225,000. What might that be? And then I'd heard that you were going to buy an RV.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering where that's at. I was told it was 55,000. Hayden Homes was going to contribute 20,000. So, but the 225,000 here, I just wonder what that was.
So that is a portion of funding designated for technical assistance, consulting, smaller contracts where we need to bring in specialized professionals to support projects. We have not done that yet, but I think there will be a number of requests. Some of those can be paid for through the governor's funding. And so we're going to try and make creative use of our funding and their funding to make strategic investments. But it was designated before my time and I'm keeping it there because I think it's helpful to have a pot of funds that can be utilized. My secondary use of those funds would probably be to add staff.
Okay, the staff is actually up above. Personnel, it shows at 274,000 for this year ending June 30th. So I'm taking that's your new possible hire. And then what is it the following year you want to add a third person? And okay.
So the initial pilot funds are $1 million. We are hoping to generate other funds that can be utilized for a longer period of time. If we do not need in this year, the contract funds that were set aside, we would utilize those to either add staff or use them for later years. I've heard from the pilot cohort that we're able to use these funds beyond the initial 2-year period. They don't expire necessarily. However, they highly recommended that we spend them because the intention is if you don't spend them, then you're not showing that you need them. So I wouldn't want to work in a scarcity sort of savings mode. If we actually need to accomplish this work is to hire staff and do the work.
Well, item number 8 says may use extra grant funds to support the delivery of homeless services and shelter consistent with the 5-year strategic plan, including contracts through service providers. So that's nice to know that, you have funds that you can actually utilize if something comes up and, you're the one that's getting asked to do it.
It's not an especially complicated budget, so we can move on to other items, but I did want to, if you have priorities.
So is the RV being purchased then?
It's sort of in limbo. I think the intention, and until we have staff on board, we wouldn't need that as an office space. The hope was to have an RV so that we have a mobile office so that we can locate throughout the region and provide office space with our partners. So when I'm up in Sisters, we have a space to meet and potentially work with clients. While this office is not necessarily delivering direct outreach or case management services, it is important that we work with our partners to understand what the needs of clients are. So I'm often out in the field or at a location trying to understand the needs of that program, and that RV could be utilized for a number of in-reach services. So if a number of street outreach providers are working in a winter storm, it's very helpful to have a mobile office that can, say, show up at Hunnell or show up out at China Hat and deliver services from an actual space. It's very limiting if we have staff without a bathroom and an office space to sit down with a client. Getting out of the weather is really critical to make connections with clients.
Okay, so I believe then if it's okay, we should go on to item number 4.
Sure. Angie, I think it might make sense to have the agenda rather than this plan, if that's okay. So in terms of the advisory council, the understanding I have from the work that was done prior to my joining the office is that there was a hope to have not just a governing board, but an advisory council, which I suspect would be a larger cross-section of providers. Councilor Perkins, you mentioned this, but having, the contributions and their perspectives on the plan, any of the work of this office. If we end up doing communications, ensuring that we have that broad diversity of perspectives. I know In the past meeting, we had mentioned very briefly, we would come up with some names. I think that it will be important to have a, cohesive way of approaching membership. And so I guess the question is for the board to understand what you'd like to see in terms of size, composition, what their sort of goals and roles are. I can offer some recommendations, but I also want to work with you to determine how that council should function.
Yeah, I don't have a sense of what we would task them with. Because I need to know that to know who I would recommend. And so, I haven't got that fully developed in my mind. At what point would we utilize them? Because you certainly don't want people taking time and effort when they're already, a lot of them are volunteers and have very busy lives. So I want to make sure we have a significant purpose for them before we gather them.
Yeah, I mean, I think
I'm
this.
gonna
this
agree with
came out of
that.
this.
Otherwise, we're actually gonna be cross-purpose because they're gonna try to create a task if we don't have them outlined.
Right.
True. Yeah, I think when we were coming up with on the task force, I think the idea behind the advisory council was just that this is a team of experts in the field that can really share their experience, their actual experience that we do not have. But I also share both of your concerns that we don't want to just leave it open to nothing. So I think in my mind, it just has to be a transparent process, so that I think that's really important to the community. And yeah, that maybe we scope out a little bit more what we're hoping to get besides just expertise, because that's a little vague.
Yeah, and it might be different people depending upon a different subject. I don't know. Are we really ready to do that? Maybe we need to get further into the process.
Maybe
where we
after our April meeting, we'll be in a better.
suss out a little bit more.
Right.
That's a good topic for a
Because,
retreat.
I've got all kinds of people that I would have in mind, but it would depend on what the question was.
Yep.
That's great.
I know the Forest Service would like to be part of that, but I just think after April's retreat, we should be in an excellent position then.
Sounds good.
Sounds good. I think one way I could see them coming into the mix would be to provide what you mentioned, specialty expertise in terms of reviewing strategic planning documents, advising on initiatives, but also sometimes functionally actually helping work happen, probably project by project. So not having everyone, 20 people working on every single project, but specialized team.
Yeah,
Yep.
almost like subcommittees, that are for a specific target, as opposed to an unwieldy board of 30 that encompasses everything.
Yeah. I will say that informally, currently, I reach out to a number of partners as thought partners. And so that is happening informally, but my hope always would be to formalize that process. So I'll add that for the list to discuss at our retreat.
Please.
All right. So I want to provide a brief update on the governor's funding package, which is, I think, likely to keep moving forward. So in a previous email, I had shared the details as I understood them from the first kickoff meeting of the multi-agency coordination meeting, or MAC group. So since then, COIC has been designated as expected to represent from like an administrative sort of functional perspective. That I think is a great choice. They're doing an excellent job with that work. They're helping herd the cats through this interesting process. I am working with COIC, HLC, and there's about 25 other agencies represented in that group. And I think there's members from a few of your entities or staff teams. At this point, the initial package was inclusive of prevention. That has now been cut out and will have its own designation. So the 14 million is only for 2 types of activities, and a additional portion, which is the 1.377 million, will be designated for prevention activities. So the 14 million can go to the development of shelter beds. I think it's 81, it's about 81 shelter beds. And the other outcome that we are required to achieve is ensuring that a number of individuals go from unsheltered status into housing. So not into shelter, into housing. And the reason I think it's important to designate those is the interventions are different. And this one is truly focused on that capacity piece. So building new capacity for sheltering. We did receive a few clarifications that I think are helpful. And I think I've shared these in settings with each of you. So they've clarified the definition of shelter, and it is it's interesting. So it requires rigid frame, so it can't be a tent. It requires electricity and heat, which is, I think, obvious, but it does not require plumbing. So projects that maybe would not have been able to meet that deadline could actually now. And settings like a pallet shelter, which we already have, could be utilized. I think notably, it does need to be provided. So safe parking where the client provides their own RV is not sheltered. You're not providing a shelter bed, that's a space to park, that's a parking space. So if a program wanted to purchase RVs and provide them, that could be considered shelter as long as they have hookups and access to bathrooms and showers, not necessarily in the RV, but on the site. But if the RV is provided by the client, that's not, so it's not, it would look the same, but it doesn't count.
I mean, I think it's really disappointing that safe parking, as I see it in the Redmond program, and then I believe there's a couple, 12 people in Bend that are part of safe parking, that they're very good at what they do. They wrap around with their services, and, not to include them seems unfortunate.
So the other requirement that was initially shared, and it's still true, is that it needs to be low barrier and use coordinated entry. And my understanding is that those programs currently use screening processes that would count as high barrier. So the intention is to meet the currently unmet need, which is the highest need we have in the county, which is, low barrier emergency shelter without screening processes, where someone can enter despite barriers that are keeping them out of housing and receive services for higher acuity needs.
Can you talk through the process? So 14 million comes to COIC. COIC has developed or has asked community partners, city, county workers, everyone, sort of service providers, what they think are the priorities for this money. And then COIC makes the determination of how it will be distributed.
Sort of. It's not COIC, it's the MAC group.
Oh, it's the MAC group. Yeah.
So
Okay.
this group of people is deciding what the priorities are and how to make decisions based on requests that we're seeing.
The COIC is just the holding the money.
Yeah.
Okay.
I would say they have done a very gracious job of being the chief convener without leading from a place of, like they have no dog in the game or fight, whatever you say. So it's, they are not looking to receive funding. In fact, I think they aren't even taking administrative funding. The intention is to quickly distribute these funds out to viable projects, and that those decisions are made in concert as a group.
Okay.
So
I thought COIC had sent out forms or had sent out like a Google or something, like kind of a doc asking people what their priorities were.
yes, so that was to get like broad perspective from the community.
They're not making that call. So that's why I'm confused.
So so those conversations are happening among the MAC group members and essentially saying, this is what we've heard, our priorities. What do we think about these? Is this the priority?
Okay.
And it's not exclusive. We don't have to just pick one.
Okay.
We're just saying, here's where we think this funding should go towards compared to other communities that might need something different.
Mhm.
And the process is largely driven from the state level, like through OHCS and OEM. It's not designed by COIC. Every community that was designated is going through the same process. There's a template, forms that we're filling out, milestones to achieve in terms of, planning for this funding in preparation to receive it. I will say anecdotally that I think that these funds will, they are one-time funds and very quick, like there's not a 3-year window for them. It's a very quick expenditure and they need to be spent, not distributed. So the ways that we're looking at how to make good decisions with these unusual funds include, does this program or project have ongoing operating funds already designated? Right? This is not meant for ongoing funding. So does this program have a plan for what they're going to do come next year? Has this project already been happening? Is it viable? Do they have experience? Is this sort of a trusted provider? What's their experience with this type of program or this type of scale? We don't want to stretch an organization way beyond what they can, handle. I will say there's a couple more notes I want to share with you to be thinking, because I'm working with most of your teams and especially at the staff level to develop some of these and further bake ideas. So one of the questions that came up is, could winter shelter be considered? And the way that we're looking at that is, yes, it can, but it wouldn't count. If we create a winter shelter bed, it wouldn't count. It would be prorated. So if it's providing 4 months of coverage, it would be prorated that way. So if you have 12 beds that are only open for 4 months, they would count essentially at a lower rate. So those are things to consider. The other question that I've received, and I think is useful for some of the programs that I know you're involved with, is that if shelter beds are at risk of going away, like if they were planned to close down, potentially funds can be used. The hope then would be, and the conversation will be dynamic, to say, what ongoing funding are you pursuing so that this is not the only funding you require? And how are you leveraging those funds using one-time funding strategically to get other funding? So leveraging, braiding, and matching, meaning you've got one set of funds, this other funding allows you to do something more effective.
I hate to bother you with this, but we're getting $14 million. And exactly what is it? What are our goals in this 81 shelter beds and then something else getting into permanent housing? How many people was that?
It's about 160.
That's
Give
what,
us a range, because
163, I think, up to that. Okay. Yeah, I know. I'm going, all right. So 81 shelter beds. What do we have any idea what that's going to cost? We don't know yet, do we?
every program's different, but to purchase housing, we sometimes think about like 100,000 per door. So if you buy a 4-bedroom, you can usually buy 4 bedrooms for 400,000. If they are micro units or motel unit studios, do they need to be rehabbed? Are these shelter or housing units? So it's entirely, you could spend 14 million on one purchase, like one.
And then who's going to run it the next year? Because I know this has to be sent by January 10th of 2024. So then how are we going to continue that? Whose burden is that going to be?
So every project that's being proposed has a different operator, right? So it's not a single purchase of a property and then no plan. There may be 20 projects that are eventually funded, right? So each project, like it might be J Bar J has a youth program, Shepherd's House might expand their sheltering. I know that Sisters is interested in securing some units, especially for families. So the hope is to distribute equitably across the region and remind ourselves that this is not just Deschutes County, this is Central Oregon more broadly.
And we do have people from Crook and Jefferson on the team, right?
On the MAC group, yes.
Okay.
Absolutely.
Because no one was able to give me the names. I just wanted to be sure.
The names of the MAC group members?
Well, yeah, if we could get a list of the MAC group members, that would be good.
So it would be startup money, and you would have to have a plan for how it would continue once that funding was spent.
So yes, and some of the projects may not be physical spaces. So if you're looking to house 5 families, what you might do instead would be a program that secures, either provides landlord engagement to get them into the units, provide security deposit, maybe a rent buy down, like provide 20,000 in advance. That can be very enticing for a landlord. If there's a family that only needs 3 months of funding, that might alleviate for, an amount for someone else. But we also want to not just think about rents, but also services, right? So if someone's placed in housing, we want to offer them sort of a ramp with services to become stable. So
And that landlord would have to understand that they would have to be willing to accept low barrier clients.
one of the challenges that I hear often from providers and even clients is that many of the interventions that this region has created are higher barrier, which is needed. And if we don't also solve for low barrier solutions, and not just low barrier sheltering, but low barrier into housing, the intention there is that we don't want to do endless sheltering. We don't want to be in the business of starting more and more shelters. Everyone deserves and needs housing, right? And housing really is so different from what shelter offers, even good shelter spaces. So we need to be thinking as a community, how do we remove barriers to housing? How do we create more permanent supportive housing with services? Otherwise, we'll see what we've seen. We have a very high, double the national average unsheltered rate. And many of them are very high acuity. So have behavioral health needs that are currently unmet and are suffering. I think the average lifespan drops 27 years for living outside. We are losing individuals at 50 instead of in their old age. Individuals who have worked, individuals who are working currently. It is very impactful on the human body to be living outside, especially with extreme heat and extreme winter weather. So the fact that we have, whereas other communities, even similar size, may have the same homeless population numbers, but such a smaller portion are actually experiencing unsheltered homelessness. The specific challenge we have is an unsheltered high acuity, and the specific capability we're missing or capacity in our system is low barrier and permanent supportive housing. If we keep pushing that down the road, or if we only produce, Cleveland Commons is great, it's only 33 units. If we don't produce at scale quickly, we will see both the number increase and the impacts increase. And it's very costly to local governments to have such high acuity individuals languishing in the streets. I mentioned that in my letter. It's we're spending this money anyways. It's going out the door every day. It costs about $10,000 to $15,000 to provide housing and services for a year. It's not very expensive. So the governor's funding is a fast train. We are on it. I am at the table and working with groups to bring projects forward and bake them and get them, advocate for them. That work you'll hear about from your staff. I know that the sisters group we've met a few times. And so if there's something that you're feeling like you want from that process, either a communication from me or some advocacy to that group, just let me know. I'm happy to be one of several representatives there. I think it's a very inclusive process, and it's meant to be as effective and broad as possible. It's not a small secret group. There's an intention to say, how can we make the best use of these funds, knowing also that more funding is coming. There are other funds for affordable housing, for other types of projects. This is just one tranche.
That's what I try and tell the folks as that get kind of discouraged because, well, we have this great idea, but this funding doesn't really isn't appropriate for that. And I said, well, this is not the only funding coming. So the work you do preparing for this funding is not going to go to waste, because that work there will be other opportunities.
Yes.
What's the latest on the OHCS? There was like 23 million last time when I was tested. Do you know, have you heard any more for shelter funding? Sorry.
Shelter funding. So I'm going to tell you high level, what I see signaled from the state level is a strong and large investment.
Yep.
So there's this commitment of funding. One of the things I'm doing is sort of tracking the range of needs and trying to identify the best use of this type of funding. So this 14 million, if we can meet the objectives, we can use funding for other purposes potentially. We don't need to spend 14 million on just that. We just have to meet those objectives. That's the first priority. It's not uncommon to have a tiering system for funding where you say the first tier meets these objectives and helps us with that plan. Second tier is an opportunity to fund projects that maybe are safe parking or other types of, getting someone from where they're living currently into safe parking and then into housing, right? But it might be next year if there's not housing. So those, I think making strategic sort of phased use of these funds and watching the landscape as it's changing. I have not ever seen this many investments coming this quickly. And OHCS, I think, is making very skillful the investments, the size of the investments, the way that these funds are so flexible gives us this rare opportunity to make good use of funding. So I think to fund ongoing operations of sheltering, to expand new shelter beds, to address system gaps like respite care, my hope for this whole process is that in a year, we have a different system that works better, not just more shelter beds. Right? We could have more shelter beds and homelessness could still go up. So how this framework that I'm offering is a way of thinking, how do we change the system fundamentally so that it works better, so that we actually eventually get out of the shelter business, right? You know, no one thinks that shelter is an end, right? It's not where someone should live. It's not where kids should live. So the goal is to actually bend the curve and eventually not need those interventions at those high doses. We are just overwhelmed right now with the huge number of individuals experiencing unsheltered homelessness with high needs. I imagine an optimistic future where in 2 or 3 years, we have cut that in half or more, and our system works much better and we can see the numbers going down, and we need less and less investment, right? This is not a mountain that we're just climbing endlessly. This is we need to bend this curve. It's a crisis. We need to get ahead of it. We saw that with COVID, same thing applies. What needs to be done to bend the curve, right?
Cheyenne, you're forgetting one of the sad points is the fact that Oregon is 50th in the nation for residential treatment beds. We are number 50. We have an addicted population, like number 2 in the nation. So you're saying one thing, but I'm thinking reality. We have a lot of people that have substance use disorder and mental illness co-occurring. And, you know, I'm really hoping that we can find a way to bring helping hands here so that they actually can do their program, because they seem to be able to make a difference. So if you know, it's just the state is at the bottom. We're at the wrong end of a lot of things, and that's not our fault, but that's what we have to deal with. And I know it's going to be a huge challenge, and I'm looking forward to next month's 4-hour meeting so that we can really dig a little deeper and figure out, okay, what is our advisory committee? We have a couple items left. I see our meeting is okay for next week. The city and roles, city county roles and responsibilities. Can we do that? Touch that at the first?
The next meeting?
Yes.
Yeah.
Is that okay? Does everyone mind? And we should have time for public comment if anybody has a raised hand. Are there any raised hands or anyone in the room that wants to make a public comment? No raised hands? Okay. Okay.
Donna runs Family Kitchen.
Hi
Is her
there.
microphone on?
She okay?
Yeah, no, I'm fine. I just didn't hear you.
Okay, great. Donna, would you, you have time to make a public comment?
Yeah, I just wanted to say that I very much appreciate this framework that's been presented today. I know we all are running around as service providers doing our best to do the work, and it's very hard to take the time to have a comprehensive plan to point towards. And I feel as though this definitely provides that, and appreciate the support in making sure this office exists, and also the time and effort that's been put together to make a plan like this that we can follow and work together toward.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you for being with us today, and thank you for your work. Donna, do you mind telling us who you work with?
Yeah, I'm the executive director of Family Kitchen, the community free meal program in Bend.
Okay, great. Family Kitchen. Thank you so much. Wonderful. Is there anyone else? All right. So Thank you all for joining us today. We will have the minutes available. What is it? Okay. Oh, sure. Okay.
Hey, excuse me. Can you guys hear me?
Yes.
Um, I'm rushing off to pick up my kids. The meeting kind of went over, so bear with me. I am curious about the data. I firmly believe that our community needs to see progress, and we need to see targets. We need to see how the targets are tracking along. Waiting for data to be somewhat perfected or at a condition to then publish it. I have a concern that it's going to take too many months of people not wanting to engage, because visibly we see our communities are declining and they're suffering on the streets. So one, data is super urgent if you truly want to have a breakthrough in Deschutes County, from my perspective, and also from various community members that I have met with, and they truly need to see the data. Second, Cheyenne mentioned about a data investment. I'm not clear on what that means, if that's a staff member, and how much money would that be, and when can we expect the data? You know, it's been 90 to 95% complete since last August. I know we're waiting for the pit count, potentially, I believe it's May, but you know, when are we going to be receiving transparency, accurate? Actually, transparency, I think, is critical. Maybe it won't be completely accurate, but we need some interim data to really understand the big picture, and kind of we're left in the dark. So that is my comment for today. Data is super critical to create breakthroughs here in Deschutes County.
Thank you so much. Okay. I better adjourn the meeting now. And thank you everyone for attending.
Thank you, guys. Appreciate it.
Thank you.